Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to another Big Data London webinar. Today we're looking at a business ROI-driven approach to migrating to cloud. So I'm Andy Steed, Content Director of Big Data London, and I'm joined today by Steve from SDG Group. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Andy.
So these sessions are designed to be interactive. Please do send in your questions at any point, and I'll endeavour to ask as many as I possibly can to Steve at the end of his presentation in the Q&A section. So quick message of housekeeping. If you lose the stream at any point, you shouldn't, but if you do, just click refresh in your browser and you'll jump straight back in with us. So however, without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our featured presenter for the day. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Andy. Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Crossan-Smith. Let me just share my screen and then we can kick off from the slides. Let me just, there we go. Excellent. So, topic of conversation today, eating the elephant. A business-driven, ROI-driven approach to migrating data architectures to cloud. As Andy says, I'm Steve Crossan-Smith. I'm the Client Director with SDG Group UK. I've been working with data for over 30 years, a mix of technical and commercial roles from running IT departments to development to product development and pre-sales and sales. So I've sat on both sides of the commercial technical divide. And really what I want to go through today is an approach that we take at SDG Group for helping companies to focus on the business ROI rather than the technical aspects of migrating data architectures to cloud. So who's SDG Group? We are an Italian-owned multinational group. We in the UK, we're based in Milton Keynes and London. The group's been around for 25 years. We're active, we have a physical presence in over 10 countries, so we're active in many more countries than that. And we've got around about 1,000 consultants. In terms of what we do, we have four main activities of areas of activity, split into five really. Data management and governance. So data management is data warehousing, data pipelines, and all the associated architecture. Governance, master data management, reference data management, metadata management, all that sort of thing. Business intelligence, which is mainly about interactive dashboarding, streaming analytics, and embedding business intelligence into things like websites and portals. Advanced analytics, which is your predictive, your descriptive, your modeling basically. And then integrated planning, you may not be so familiar with. That's a mechanism or a tool set by which different departments in your organization can create scenario planning, and then they can see the implications of different scenarios on each other's plans. Definitely not the topic for today. We operate these days. I think it's probably fair to say the vast majority of our work is with cloud, which is the way the industry has inexorably gone. We also do still, of course, work on premise, and we offer managed services for companies as well as solutions and advice. So, coming back to the main theme of the day. How do you eat an elephant? You ask any 11-year-old this question, and they're going to come up with a stock answer, which is one bite at a time. Bit of a theme for today, really, because we're going to consider how to bite the elephant, how to eat the elephant, for moving from legacy on-premise architectures into modern cloud-based data architectures. Fundamentally, this is not about the technology. It's really more about the approach, but I will touch on some of the technologies that we use right at the end. Everything starts with why, and I think that's a very healthy thing, and it should continue to consider why. Whatever you're doing, whatever change or whatever activity you're doing, you should always have a good healthy dose of why. And I've written whole blogs on this topic. But let's consider today. We're going to consider four whys. We're going to consider why become data driven at all. We're going to consider why cloud in today's world. Why our approach, or why do we take the approach that we take as opposed to any other? And why the architecture that we like to work with, we've chosen to work with. Try and answer those four whys throughout this presentation as best I can. So firstly, let's start from basics. What do we mean by a data-driven organization? Well, by that, we really mean an organization in which all important business decisions are informed by data, not gut feel, not what happened last year, anything like that. It's informed by data, what is going on, certainly taking into account history, but not being tied to it. Throwing some numbers on the screen, let's put some numbers around this why become data-driven piece. Some of you, many of you, I'm sure you're quite familiar with McKinsey, an international market research company or industrial commentator. They wrote a paper in September 2019. So interestingly, just several months before COVID hit us. Catch them if you can, it's called, How Leaders in Data Analytics Have Pulled Ahead. And I would suggest, by the way, that what we're about to discuss is even more relevant in I would say a post-COVID world, but we're some way away from having a post-COVID world. They did a piece of research, and they discovered that high-performing organizations are 3 times more likely to say that data analytics have contributed at least 20% or more to EBIT, that's earnings before interest and taxation, so your operating profit, over the past 3 years. They also, in the same piece of research, found that 47% of respondents said that data and analytics have significantly or fundamentally changed the nature of competition in their industries in the past 3 years. Now, these two statements are both very interesting in their own right. The left-hand statement is about applying analytics to optimizing your business, doing things better. But the right-hand statement really is talking about disruption. It's talking about how people leverage data to disrupt a marketplace and gain competitive advantage by means of as a result of doing so. And in many ways, the returns from that can be much higher. So we all know what's going on in the marketplace at the moment. COVID is causing chaos across multiple industries, no more less so than in high street retail. And recently I was talking to a chap who runs the analytics group for a well-known high street fashion retailer. You would know them. And like most fashion retailers, they're having to make some really tough staffing decisions at the moment. But he seemed reasonably relaxed with regards to his own position. And I asked him about that. And he said, you know what, Steve, data isn't going out of fashion. And that's a really simple but quite a profound statement, because he's absolutely right. Data isn't going out of fashion. It's not going out of grocery. It's not going out of energy and utilities, life sciences, financial services, manufacturing, or any other industry. If anything, data is coming to the forefront, because the more uncertainty there is around a marketplace, the more you really need to know exactly what's going on in the moment so that you can make decisions based on that. And that's really brings us back to why data-driven. The second statement is why cloud? Forgive the pun, I couldn't resist this. To cloud or not to cloud? That is the question. Interestingly, to a large degree, I would suggest that this argument is one in most industries. It's very rare in most industries that we end up having a debate as to whether cloud is a good thing. It does happen, but it's very rare. But what is important to understand is 2 things. Firstly, there's a difference between leveraging cloud technologies and running technologies which are compatible with cloud. The latter is more of a lift and shift. So instead of running it on-prem, you will run it on servers which happen to be located in the cloud. But then there's cloud native, which is actually leveraging some of the true capabilities of a cloud platform. And that's where you get most of the benefits. But it's also important to understand when you're considering why cloud, and all of this, by the way, the reason I'm going through all of this is to help to formulate in people's minds the main tenets of a business case, because nowadays not many projects happen without a business case. So I'm trying to build up the various components that would help with this. And it's very important when you're doing so to consider the different perspectives between IT and the business when it comes to the benefits of cloud. For IT, they're mainly about the practical side of cloud. So one of the beauties about cloud is you have building block services. You're not, generally speaking, having to install software. You're commissioning services. You're combining services to create a solution. Elasticity is huge. I've worked with data warehouses for many, many years, and the work that was needed to estimate peak load on a data warehouse, architect for that peak load, because your warehouse simply had to work at that time. And then you inevitably end up with what you could call an over-engineered solution for 80% of the time. That's inevitable. You were basically creating a solution that had to perform during that peak load. The beauty about cloud native technologies is the fact that they're, generally speaking, they're inherently elastic. They can very quickly automatically scale up. They can scale back down again according to the requirements. And that's huge from an IT perspective. It takes away an enormous amount of headache. Resilience, again, it's something that you had to very carefully architect into on-premise architectures. To a large degree, we take it for granted in cloud, certainly at the base level of resilience. Even very simple things like storage, putting data into Amazon S3 buckets and things like that. There's an inherent amount of resilience behind the scenes that most of us don't even think about. We just expect that service to be there. And that's because of the enormous amount of behind the scenes engineering which has gone on. And then there's low maintenance, again, huge. Certainly when I ran IT departments, a lot of our time, and it's still the case for traditional systems today, a lot of our time was just involved in making sure software is up to date, making sure hardware wasn't failing, making sure that things were optimized around the database indexing and all that sort of good stuff. That all takes a huge amount of time. And to a very large degree, which is often underestimated, all of that goes away when you're using cloud native technologies. The business, to a very large degree, actually don't really care about that at that level of detail. They have related perspectives, but if you're trying to write a business case that's going to get signed off by the business, you really need to be thinking more in terms of their language. What they care about is time to value. How quickly can I have my problem solved? And when the inevitable change in circumstances comes around, how agile can I be in terms of reconfiguring that service or whatever it is that I'm trying to do? In terms of performance, it just has to work at the required performance all of the time. In terms of reliability, if there is nothing will drive business users away from your system faster than poor performance and poor reliability. They will find ways around your beautifully crafted system as best they can, and unfortunately that often involves unhealthy doses of things like Excel. And spend pattern. This is an interesting one because businesses, let's take an example of marketing, for example. Marketing runs on the basis of campaigns. Campaigns normally have a budget associated with them. It's very useful for the business to be able to tailor their spend pattern along with their the rest of the spend around their campaign, their business spend pattern. And that's possible to a large degree with cloud technologies, because often these things have pay-as-you-go type of licensing, consumption-based licensing, which lends itself very well to matching to business requirements in that area. So you've got third-party commentators saying being data-driven is a great thing. You've got companies who, to a large degree, don't raise any objections to the fact that cloud is a great way to go. And yet the uptake in moving away from legacy systems to cloud is possibly slower than certainly I would imagine, bearing in mind how many years we've been talking about this. But so what's holding it back? Now, obviously, we talk about this every single day with customers, and there are a few themes which generally come up. One of them is around business priorities. One of them is around time to value, because generally speaking, business cases these days, if you can't show a time to value in something like 3 months, then that project is going to get downgraded for something else, perhaps more tactical, which can do exactly that. The common one, which is the nearest one to a technical issue, is access to data. This is absolutely a common thing which we come across a lot. Data is locked away in legacy systems. It's locked away in files all over the place. It's a real serious problem for the expansion of both cloud technologies, because you have to get that data into the cloud, and being data driven in general. The business priorities is an interesting one, because that probably means that you haven't managed to associate a big enough business problem with the initiatives that you're looking to take forward. And that's something we'll talk about in a moment. Time to value, well, business, they just want their problem solving now. There is no future. They don't have the luxury of waiting for a perfect solution later. They need something that solves the problem now. It's just the pace of business today. So how can we address this? What can we do to meet the business, basically, when it comes to doing this sort of thing? Well, I'm going to consider several areas. I'm going to two areas really: the approach and the architecture. The architecture is very much the lesser part of this presentation. That I'm going to touch on that at the end. But the most important thing is the approach. You know, how does SDG Group approach this sort of thing in the field? Starts with, we need a relentless focus on business outcomes. Frankly, there are several things the business don't care about. They don't care about how technically elegant your solution is. And they also, generally speaking, not so much the business as the finance people, they also don't care how easy you make somebody's life. They really don't. And I've had this conversation so many times where people have created business cases which have largely been around making somebody's life easier. And the argument always starts out that if you put a monetary amount on somebody's time, you can justify a business case by doing that. The problem with that argument is basically the fact that either that person is genuinely going to be able to produce more revenue, which is generally what this comes down to, or reduce costs in that extra time, or you're going to lay people off, which is always an uncomfortable conversation. So the most important thing is to focus on the business outcomes, the positive business outcomes which have value. First step, build a list of valuable business outcomes, exactly what I was just saying. So fundamentally, this is about talking to the business, finding out what their problems are. Don't focus on anything to do with technology. Focus on what business outcome. We're not even talking data and analytics at this point. We're talking about what business outcome could help you to drive the business forward. And build yourself a list, and where possible, have the business put some sort of prioritization on that. And where you can, value. That's very, very important. A really important point. Initiatives live or die by adoption. History is littered with solutions which were technically superior. I don't know how many of you on this call are too young to remember this beast, but this is a Betamax tape. In the years when the great battle was Betamax versus VHS, most pundits accepted and promoted the fact that Betamax was a technically superior solution for video, but VHS, as we all know, overwhelmingly won the war. And they won the war on the basis of adoption. This is something I'd really like us to keep front of mind as we go through this. A solution to somebody's problem that is not adopted basically becomes a white elephant. So when we talk about eating the elephant, we don't want to end up eating a white elephant, because believe me, that will choke you. So how do we go about this? So we've got ourselves a list of potential business outcomes. From that, what we're trying to plot effectively, and most people will be familiar with this sort of a plot, we're plotting effort against value. Now, I would also suggest that effort and risk are often interchangeable. So as you can see on here, I'm going to come to the size of the balloon in just a moment, but you've got effort getting increasing as you go to the right, value increasing as you go to the top of the screen. I've introduced a new term which I'd suggest is important to consider, and that's something called advocacy. Now, advocacy essentially is to do with business sponsorship. Business sponsorship is basically you're looking for a business sponsor who is passionate about solving the problem for the sake of solving the problem. In other words, what does that problem do for the business, not as a technical exercise? But it's also important that your sponsor has enough gravitas and reach to be able to spread good news. And this is coming back to adoption. You need people to be talking about the great things which you've been able to do for this hero project. And people who've worked with me will often have heard me talk about a hero project. What is a hero project? It's a project that you can choose which allows you to showcase your ability to deliver business value. It's not trying to showcase your ability to be really clever technologically. It's talking about showcasing your ability to add value to the business. You want, of course, to look for something which is low risk / low effort, reasonable value. And it'd be very tempting. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it'd be very tempting to go for this very large circle on the right, which has got very high value. It's also got very high effort, which I would raise a red flag, because that has high risk written on it for a first hero project. But it's got very high levels of advocacy. Now, I would tend to call this a superhero project, and you probably want to avoid superhero projects initially, because what you're trying to do is demonstrate your ability to get projects done. Perhaps keep that one for a second or third project. It's also tempting to go for this, the top left, the smaller circle, because this one's got probably the highest value on the page almost, and the lowest level of effort, but relatively low levels of advocacy. So if you're not careful, you could end up doing a fantastic piece of, adding a fantastic piece of business value that nobody ever gets to hear about, and you end up being the Betamax. You really don't want to do that. I would probably go for this one, just as a piece of advice. So it's fairly low effort, reasonable level of value, high levels of advocacy. These things are always a compromise. Really important though, beware of dependencies on these things. You do not want a hero project that is dependent on another project. Lots of reasons for that, but the primary one is you lose control and you lose the ability to be in control of your own destiny, and therefore your hero project can be knocked off track for something which has nothing to do with your capabilities and your ability to execute. So having found that hero project and essentially prioritized your list of business outcomes, then what you do with it is a repeat a 4-stage process. First stage is determine what is going to be your first. Take your first objective and line the others up and go for the next one when you're iterating around this loop. Identify the insights and metrics needed to achieve and measure the outcomes. So everything up to that point has been around the business outcome itself. Now you're going to drill inside that with the business and say, okay, in order to achieve that, Mr. Line of Business owner or whoever you're dealing with, what do you need to know? What insight, what metrics do you need available to you? From there, you're then going down the chain to look for, well, okay, now that I know what they need to know, where is the data? What state is that data in? You need to audit that data in order to understand whether it's usable, whether it's missing, whether you have to source new pieces of data and all that sort of stuff. Now, I appreciate it's very tempting to do this the other way around, to start by saying, well, look, here's the data we've got available. Now, Mr. Business, what could we, or Mrs. Business, forgive me, what could we do with that data? Actually, you're better off going the other way around because you can genuinely focus on what will have the greatest business impact. Now, you'll notice up until this point, you could argue that the data stage has started to become technical, perhaps, but fundamentally, you don't get to the really nuts and bolts technical side of things until stage 4. This is not about the technology first. This is about building up to that and then incorporating the data into the data platform that you've chosen and building the outputs so that the business end user gets to interact with that, and then iterate. So we talk about a horizontal approach rather than a vertical approach, and this is more of a technical approach discussion than anything else. You're starting with your data sources, which today can be quite varied, everything from traditional databases, files, API-driven systems, you name it. We're dealing with a much wider variety of data than we ever had to deal with before. We all know that. At the other end, you've got your business users and you've got a set of business outcomes which they would like. A fairly traditional approach to this is to basically take this a layer at a time. This is why we call it a horizontal approach. So spend a lot of time designing and building what you hope is the perfect ingestion process where you've found all the data you're going to need, you bring it all in, and then what you do with that data is you model it, you transform it into a format, an internal storage format, which is going to be well suited to the sort of workloads that you're looking to service. The temptation is to spend an enormous amount of time trying to create the perfect business model. And this relates back to what I was saying before. Very, very difficult to do for reasons I'm going to explain in a moment. Then you build some visualizations or some way of the end user interacting with that data, whether it's serving them with data or some form of visualizations or whatever. The obvious problem with this, well, there are a couple of, there's an obvious problem and a number of less obvious problems, but the obvious problem is your pro business user doesn't actually get to see what they consider to be progress until all of those preceding steps have been taken. And that can be quite a wait, many months, maybe even over a year before that happens. And we see this happening a lot. We prefer to promote what we call a vertical approach. And a vertical approach starts from the same set of data sources, same set of users, probably the same set of business outcomes, but now hopefully you've prioritized them in the way that we described earlier, and you've chosen your hero project, and you focus relentlessly on that business outcome. And what we actually propose and what we suggest in the way we implement projects is essentially what you do is you do what you need to do in the ingestion stage in order to capture just the data you need to meet that business outcome. You do the amount of modeling that you require in order to do so, and you create the visualizations that service that business outcome. The net result of this is that you haven't tried to create the perfect solution, but what you have done is you've met, as in the perfect all-reaching solution, but what you've done is you've met that business requirement. You deliver business value much, much quicker than you do through the horizontal approach. And then what you do is you focus on your next problem, you do the same, and you do the same. Pros and cons, of course, to both approaches, but this one we find for business intelligence works exceptionally well. The data-related projects works exceptionally well. This translates, as some of you will be aware, almost to the sort of waterfall versus agile approach. There's certain similarities here. A lot of you will be familiar with both of these, but waterfall approach, you start by trying to define everything that you can about the project that you're executing. You do extensive research around requirements, data, etc., etc. You then do a design to meet the requirements, and from there you build a solution, you test that solution, you deliver that solution, and the most immediate problem, as it was on the previous slide, is that the end user doesn't actually get to see any business benefit until all of those steps have been done. There's another more invidious problem as well, which is not necessarily obvious, but which I have seen and we've all seen time and time again. Where you're talking about data-related projects, and I've genericized that by calling them BI or advanced analytics projects, the nature of the beast is that as you gain insight by gaining better access to data, better access to insight in general, your perception of the world changes. Your perception of all of the assumptions that you made when you first tried to define your requirements, they change. So in many cases, what you thought were a perfectly good set of requirements at the beginning, firstly, you didn't know what you didn't know. But secondly, some of the assumptions you made can be invalidated as you start to get that early insight. So in many ways, that dooms a waterfall approach. You end up inevitably having a significant amount of change management. Brings us nicely onto an agile project approach. And don't get me wrong, discussions around project methodologies can almost become religious in nature at times. I'm absolutely not interested in that. I'm talking about considering these things as general approaches. Fundamentally, what you do with an agile approach is you eat the elephant one bite at a time. So you initiate a program of work and you break down your overall set of objectives into hopefully manageable chunks called sprints. They're time box periods, and within those time box periods, you don't try and eat the elephant in one go. You basically break it up into a number of bites, which you loosely define as you're planning the project, and then you define what happens in each sprint in more detail as you get into the sprint. It suits business intelligence extremely well, bearing in mind you don't know what you don't know. As you go through earlier sprints, that can often help to define in more detail what it is that you need to do in later stages of the project. And then when you finish the overall program of work, the program of projects maybe, you close that off. But let's look at sprints individually. Again, all very conceptual. I'm not interested in getting into specific methodologies and all that sort of stuff. Fundamentally, they're all the same. When you go into a sprint, you have a fairly lightweight kickoff, and that kickoff is about understanding where you left off from the last sprint, what you want to achieve or what you need to achieve in this sprint, and then you're into a design, build, test, deliver, design, build, test, deliver type of cycle. So what you end up doing is you're not trying to create the perfect finished solution in one hit. What you're doing is you're incrementally delivering business value. Very important as well that throughout all stages, business and IT stakeholders are involved throughout. We tend to have things called stand-ups, which are daily or twice weekly or 3 times weekly, whatever they are. very quick 15-minute sessions. You want to make sure that IT and business stakeholders are involved in those so that every single decision and prioritization, because quite often scope needs to be prioritized, can be handled by all interested stakeholders. One interesting thing about this is your time to value is inherently shorter, but also because you're doing incremental releases, sometimes even within a sprint, then sometimes it's even before the end of the first sprint, you can start to deliver business value, not the end solution, but you can start to deliver business value. And that's very important because that means that the business have some gain that they, hopefully, if you've chosen the right advocates, they will promote for you. So that's kind of the approach that we take. Well, in fact, it is the approach that we take, and the reasons that we take it. And it is very much all around advocacy, because we tend to find that success breeds success. So flipping to the other side for the moment, what particular cloud data architecture do we like to use? What's our sort of blueprint reference architecture, if you like? And any of you who've seen some of our presentations before may well be familiar with some of this, but let me just very briefly overview it for you. As we said before, wide variety of data sources, database, API-driven file, and I've just put social media as their own little special category at the bottom there. In the center of this is a cloud-based data platform, and the objective is to use that to house and manage the data required. The first stage to this is getting data in. And one of the beauties about cloud is that storage is exceptionally cheap. Something like, I think we get quoted something like $23 a terabyte a month, something like that. So crazy cheap when you consider specialized SAN-based high-performance data storage that you would have on premise. And this is done by a category of tools called data pipelines. Data pipelines, really, their sole job primarily is to connect to data sources, load data into staging area of the cloud data platform, the cloud data warehouse, and then do an initial data load and then keep that data synchronized. So if there are changes in the host systems, synchronize those changes through to the staging area. Also, though, if there are any changes to the structure of those source systems, then that also gets passed through to the staging area. Very little emphasis on crafting that data for end user purposes. It's really about understanding the structure and format of those host data sources and getting the data in. From there, that's when you apply most of your transformation. And this is another area where there have been some developments in recent years with the almost unlimited power that you can gain from an elastic cloud solution, which can spike and drop back again as needed. There's a new paradigm. I guess many of us are familiar with ETL, extract, transform, load, where what would basically happen is your transform server or servers would pull data out of the staging area, apply some logic locally with local code on its own server, and then push the results back into the data warehouse. A couple of issues with that fundamentally, although it's immensely powerful. However, you are moving data around, which brings additional latency, but it also potentially means that you're taking data out of a secure environment, moving it into another environment, and putting it back again. And that is always going to be risky. But your end state out of this is to have created a set of one or more modeled layers, which basically means nothing more than applying the business logic, the enhancement of the data, the transformation of that data, so that it's in a format which is really suitable for business applications like business intelligence or advanced analytics, that sort of thing. You may well also be adding governance at this point. So this is really about having a trust in your data and a common understanding of data. It's not a topic for today. That's a whole topic in itself. But again, that is something that you may well be applying alongside your data warehousing. And this one, data services, I've shown this as a dotted line for the very simple reason that in many, many cases, data services, which is basically what controls how people get access to data, the technical protocols which can be used to access that data, all that sort of stuff. It's the distribution layer, if you like. More often than not, that's just an inherent part of the cloud data warehouse platform. But there are some use cases where actually it's a good idea to have an additional data services layer, something called a data virtualization layer. And that is really a couple of examples that jump to mind. You may have some highly secure repositories where you're simply not allowed to take data out of them and move it into a cloud data warehouse, irrespective of how secure that is. You're just not allowed to do it. In which case you may be allowed to query those through some sort of an API. And the other one which jumps to mind is you may have different data warehouse technologies around the world with significant amounts of data in them. It's just not practical to be able to pull all of that data into each different region and create sort of Uber data warehouses for each for all of the global data in each different region. That's quite an undertaking. And if these are heterogeneous different technologies, it's quite difficult to come up with a solution for that. Data services can help with that, data virtualization rather, because it can communicate with all of those different heterogeneous technologies, and it can make them look like one consolidated data source to the consumers of data, which are coming up in just a moment. So just a couple of examples where external data services, data virtualization can be useful. Then, of course, you've got your what you might call your interaction layer. I've simplified it by just calling it a visualization layer here. Either this is going to be something the customer already has, or they're going to ask us to do it for them, whichever, or you guys to do it, whichever. But there is a user interface of some description, an interaction interface. And then increasingly, we're being asked about advanced analytics. Well, advanced analytics fits across the piece here. And it can hook into this platform at various different stages. It may well be pulling data directly from a social media platform and working on that. It may well be pulling data from a relatively unstructured staging area, or untransformed, should I say, staging area in your cloud data platform. Or you may well be creating, because that's not optimal for advanced analytics, but neither is a business intelligence schema. This business intelligence model, generally speaking, is not optimized for advanced analytics. So you may have different stages. And also in our case, a lot of the advanced analytics we're doing is integrated into the visualization layer because it's informing users of next actions and all that sort of good stuff. And then you have your consumers. So multiple different types of consumers. This is another area which has expanded significantly over the years. You might have programs, machines which are interacting. You might have internal and external users and stakeholders. You might have anonymous users. So that would be a situation where you'd embedded BI into your website, for example, something like that. All sorts of different users, all of which can be handled with this. Just to sort of complete the picture, it will make it a little messy, I'll apologize. Some of the technologies that we tend to work with at different stages. On the data pipeline technology we've been working with for the longest is something called Fivetran. Matillion now does also have data pipelining capabilities, but Matillion for us has historically been the transformation engine, one of these ELT transformation engines, which generates the SQL, pushes that down to the cloud data warehouse in order to do the transformation within the cloud data warehouse. Snowflake is definitely our go-to cloud data platform, our cloud data warehouse of choice. We do work with others as well, of course. And then on the governance side, the data services side, if the data services is just part of the data warehouse, then generally that'd be Snowflake. If it's external, then it would be probably TIBCO in our case. Similarly with governance, we work primarily with TIBCO. Advanced analytics, again, TIBCO and Data IQ. Visualization, wow, there's a huge range of visualization tools out there. Again, one of our preferred tools of choice is TIBCO. A lot of customers use Power BI, and we also work with Tableau and a variety of others. So that's just to complete the picture there. Very quickly, in the last few minutes, just to give you two very quick case studies. One of them is a global market research company. And the problem that this company had was, as with most companies, their data volumes were going crazy. And what they were doing is they were creating customer-facing insight. And they were doing this using PowerPoint. So basically, they had localized data files. They were generating very good-looking PowerPoint presentations, which is absolutely not unusual for market research companies, turning those into documents. And you had hundreds of executives creating thousands of PowerPoint which would then get delivered either as PowerPoints or as PDF files. And they had issues because they had all this data in data files. They had to share that data. And of course, how can you be agile in a situation like this? Some notable points about the engagement. We had very strong advocacy. We had somebody who had a very strong belief in fixing this problem. It was business driven. This was a business line of business owner. A hero project was fairly quickly identified, and the outcome was it took us 8 weeks to deliver a complete rounded cloud-based solution. It's a robust and elastic cloud infrastructure, which scales very nicely. And we replaced all of the PowerPoint. I'm going to call it an interactive GUI. Essentially, it is based on a business intelligence dashboarding tool, but you would never know it. It looks completely, it looks as if it's not a tool at all. It looks completely customized. And that's perfectly possible to do with some of the browser-based technologies these days. And the success story spreading, advocacy. This particular sponsor is a strong advocate, and they're very keen on spreading the good word around the much larger organization. This is a very large organization, and sure enough, that's leading to other requirements coming forward. Second one is a major supply chain logistics company. Their problem was slightly different. They had a service compliance problem. As much as anything, in part of this, they didn't necessarily know when they were meeting whether they were meeting compliance or not. In some instances, where they did know, then it wasn't what they wanted it to be. They had disconnected data sources. This was the hub of the problem. They were doing a lot of manual processing, and it was all very siloed. They were pretty good at monitoring any one of their many processes, but they weren't tooled up really for bridging those silos. As a result, they had a pretty unhappy customer who wasn't happy with the service level. And that's dangerous. So notable points, again, a strong advocate, which was a business analyst who believed passionately that this was a soluble problem and it was worth solving. Very compelling reason for change. An unhappy customer, a big unhappy customer is often a really compelling reason for change. There was an obvious initial problem to solve. Result of that, within 6 weeks, we built them a cloud-based solution, which allowed them to dramatically improve their compliance figures. And I mean really dramatically, to very close to 100% from something which was nowhere near 100%. It was cloud-based. It happened to be a managed service that we're running for them. And that, again, has led to additional use cases. And again, that comes from advocacy. This could quite easily have been just a little solution that solved a problem really well and that nobody else within the business got to hear about. But there was advocacy there, and that's led to additional use cases. Brilliant. Just what we're looking for as an organization. So if I'm going to summarize all of this, I would suggest, and I would strongly suggest, that you have a relentless focus on business outcomes. Solve one business problem at a time. Don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to eat the elephant in one go. Seek advocates as sponsors. It's not just the case that you want somebody who's got a big, hairy problem. You need somebody who's got a problem that you can solve with relatively low risk and who will tell other people about that and will promote it. And adopt an agile approach works exceptionally well for most data-related projects. And it's certainly stood us in very good stead, as well as this vertical versus horizontal approach, which has been a real rock for us. Leverage cloud technologies. Don't just lift and shift. Don't just take a piece of on-premise software, lift it, and then load it onto a virtual machine in cloud and say, brilliant, I've now become cloud. Because if you do that, you'll be missing out on so many of the benefits that cloud technologies have to offer. And with that, I hand it back to Andy to whoops, let me just press that button, to help out with any questions.
Perfect. And before we go into some questions, and we've got some here, and I've got some of my own, but I think we'll go with the audience questions. There's some good questions today. I just wanted to say that for anybody who's looking to go over anything that Steve's mentioned in that presentation again, this will be available on demand almost instantly after we finish. So you can go back in, rewind, fast forward to your heart's content, and look at certain little bits of the flowchart diagrams and slides again, should you wish. Thank you very much, Steve, for a great job. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was very clear. So also want to point your attention to the attachments in the bottom left-hand corner. Steve's put some attachments there from SDG that should support this presentation and should help if you want to look a little bit further into detail in this. There's also the link to the newly launched Big Data London virtual event. So if you haven't already signed up for that, please do, using the link in the bottom left-hand corner. However, I'll dive straight into these questions then on the that you've sent through. Firstly, I think it's rewinding a little bit, Steve, where we were talking about hero projects and advocates and stuff. Someone's asked, what's a typical department would you find a business advocate? If you'd like to maybe, in your experience, then obviously from everywhere, but.
There's no one answer to that. We have business advocates from almost every department you can imagine, actually. Classically, then, well, in fact, most of them. Finance, obviously, tend to have their own issues. Operations, marketing, sales, depending. If you're in life sciences and things like that, you'll often find that it's a sales-driven requirement. All of the above. All of the above. There are very few, even HR has requirements. They're rarely, if I'm honest, a place where we start, HR, but they certainly have requirements. But mostly, it's the usual suspects, and so marketing, marketing, finance, operations, all of the above.
Yeah, perfect. And I'm guessing this is referring to the bit where we were looking at some of these sort of agile methodologies and stuff, and it's how different are BI and data analytics projects from general software development projects, and then it said, how different stroke similar should they be? I mean, should they in your experience, when we're doing this sort of thing successfully?
So that's a half an hour conversation, but let's take it real simple. Obviously there are some good solid tenets which need to be common to all projects. The tenets of project management, whether you're using an Agile or a Waterfall or any hybrid methodology or any methodology which is out there, there are some obvious things that need to be focused on. And actually, most of what I said, that none of that is radical. None of that is not out there built into most methodologies. I mean, even the things like a relentless view on a relentless focus on business deliverables, it's one of the first principles of Prince 2. Is the fact that you should focus on the deliverables. So in that respect, there's good project management or good project disciplines which should be common across all of the piece. I guess you could argue that in some respects, a lot of what I've said about having business stakeholder involvement, that's, in my experience from when I ran product development teams, you absolutely need that. But there are areas of product development where you need to keep your business stakeholders away because it's just deep down and dirty and technical. I would suggest that's less so with a modern cloud data architecture, because you get to business deliverables quicker than sometimes otherwise. Where is it different? I would suggest that in my experience, the main difference is you don't know what you don't know. Now, sure, that you could apply that to pretty well any environment, but when you're designing a product, you, generally speaking, because of the nature of product and the release cycles, you have to know a lot of this stuff. You can't kind of make it up as you go along. Although, frankly, looking at modern apps and things, and the amount of times that my iPhone updates, I sometimes wonder about that. But generally speaking, with a product, you try anyway to have a formalized release cycle, and therefore you have to solidify what's going into that release cycle. With a business intelligence product or a data-driven project, you can discover as you go, and you are going to discover. Even if you think you're not, then the number of times that I've seen business intelligence stakeholders learn something new, right, even at the data audit stage, right at the very beginning, where you're just trying to understand the data assets they've got. And that can throw the whole thing in a different direction. So I would say that that's probably the biggest difference, if I was to choose one thing, is the fact that you have to inherently accept the fact that you don't know what you don't know if you're embarking on a project that is taking your data-driven capabilities forward.
Perfect. Good question. A good answer too, actually. I'm going to reword this question slightly. I think it's a good question, but it's do you think that the data analytics function should sit outside the IT function? I'm going to reword that to, in your experience, with these projects, does it work better if the data analytics function sits outside the IT function, or does it not matter?
Well, it's an interesting question. It is an interesting question, because I would unquestionably say that the trend has been towards the fact that it is moving away from the IT function, and I guess in many ways I'd support that. You do end up with a situation where you have a foot partly in each camp, but where the delineation comes in, we often have this with customers, where they have a BI function or which is an analytics function, which have great SQL skills. They may even have great programming skills around Python and all the rest of it, but their architectural skills just aren't there. They don't care. Why would they care about networking and all that sort of good stuff? And to a degree, cloud sort of enables those people to a large degree. But similarly, most, and please don't string me up if there are BI and data analytics people on the call here, most of the time, these guys don't care so much about process, governance, security to a point. There are just some dull things that need to go into a corporate platform, particularly in a world of GDPR, which IT do care about. They care a lot more about repeatability. They care a lot about maintainability and things like that. Whereas to a large degree, BI and particularly data analysts, they've got a question, they need an answer to that question, and it may well be yesterday's news tomorrow. So do I think it should live outside of IT? I do think they're different mindsets. I think BI and data analytics is closer, or needs to be closer, to a business mindset. But I think there are disciplines which are necessary and which tend to live more on the IT side of things. So yes, I would tend to sit on the side of saying that, yes, I think it's a good thing that they are going in the direction that they are.
Perfect. And before we go back to one, we've had one just come in saying about a fast-growing data set. Is that a good reason to? There's lots of reasons that would come to cost and everything, but having a data set that's very, very expanding very, very quickly, is that a good reason to move to cloud? I'm guessing that's the situation.
Yes, but that can be a double-edged sword, of course. It is a good reason to move to cloud for the very simple reason that the elasticity I was talking about, it applies to storage, it applies to compute, it applies to all layers in the solution. I've worked many times. I mean, retailers, this is a classic problem. Their data can absolutely go crazy, particularly at peak times. And in traditional architectures, the work that's required to keep upgrading that architecture, even just in terms of storage, is phenomenal. That largely goes away. You then have another problem, of course, because there is a big fat depends, which is, well, it depends on what's sourcing this data in the first place. But even that nowadays, we work with companies who have phenomenal throughput of data. And there are ways these days of getting that data into the cloud much more efficiently than there were even 5, 6, 7 years ago. So the classic thing which has held people away from large volume in the cloud has always been, how on earth do you get that data in the cloud? Truth is, an awful lot and an increasing amount of data starts in the cloud. So actually, even if it's not within the same cloud, these guys have got phenomenal backbone infrastructure, and moving it around is much easier than it ever was. So yes, it is. That's the short answer to a long answer that I gave.
And another one on kind of adoption and stuff is cloud really cheaper than on-premise? It's a difficult question, but
it's a reasonable question, and it comes with it depends. Let me be honest. The it depends on whether you're leveraging cloud or simply lifting and shifting, and whether you're comparing like for like. So let's take those one at a time. Let's just do the lift and shift. If you take a piece of on-premise software and you lift it and you drop it into a cloud solution, it may or may not be cheaper in that cloud solution, depending on several things. Number one, depending on whether moving that into the cloud reduces the maintenance overhead, which it may do. Depending on whether you take into account the fact that if you do it right, you will probably get a much greater level of resilience, which you're probably conveniently ignoring on your single-ended server with no backup readily available. So it is a depends, because comparing like for like is really important when you talk about cheaper. The other thing, though, is if you're comparing even a well-architected data warehouse on premise with a cloud-based data warehouse, the elasticity tends to come to play. But even that is a depends, because if you badly configure a cloud-based data platform, you can burn money really quickly. But that's not the fault of the platform. It's the fault of understanding what it is, what you have to do in order to make sure that the elasticity is working in your favor, because it doesn't know that you're going to not how your peaks and troughs work. It doesn't know that you may have that you may not want it to stay alive, because a peak and a trough can be very closely spaced together. It just doesn't know that. But you can configure these platforms to make sure that it will quiesce really quickly, for example, if there's no activity, or to say, well, I know there's going to be frequent but spaced levels of activity, therefore I can't have it doing that because I want maximal performance. All of this has a cost implication, because all the time, generally speaking, on a consumption-based model, all the time that you're processing, or even in many cases having a machine live, it's costing you money. So it is definitely a depends, but I would unquestionably say that for an industry strength and data warehouse solution, the costs associated with doing it in cloud, if it's done properly, are significantly less than the way most of us did it 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago.
Perfect. And I think actually we'll wrap it up there. We did have some excellent questions today, actually, and we had a few more that I haven't been able to get to. So thanks very much for sending those over. I'd like to thank Steve for his excellent presentation and lively answering questions. I thought there were some really, really good answers in there as well as the good questions. So thank you very much for that, Steve. And from us both, it's goodbye for now, and we'll see you at the next one. So goodbye, everyone, and thank you very much for watching. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.